the opportunity. Let me first pay my respects to the traditional delegation for a few days. Is on certain aspects of the infrastructure provisions of our. It's not a very long brief, and what makes it even better is because some of the content within the brief have been discussed quite extensively throughout the last few days. And before I get into any specifics on the brief itself, I thought it might be helpful if I just kind of gave a very quick update on where we are with the compact agreements writ large. Our negotiations started some 3 or so years ago, and it is about 97% complete at this point. What we have done to date is signed some significant bilateral agreements with the United States. One of them is the Title II Amendment, which is really part of the core of this new version of the compact. It is the economic provisions, which is what Title II is. We've also signed bilaterally and agreed to a new compact trust fund agreement, which is another major agreement in the package. And then we've also signed one of the more important subsidiary agreements, and that is the Fiscal Procedures Agreement, which and execution of the provision right away required in order for the package as we know it today to move forward. And so that package that we have signed currently has already been transmitted to our FSM Congress. And to my knowledge, it's also been transmitted to the state governors and the legislative bodies of the states of the FSM. So those core agreements that have been signed have been transmitted, and they're available for viewing or for use. The States Congress, the implementing legislation to be called Public Law 108-188, which contains a lot of the implementing language for the compact for the U.S. Congress's consideration. U.S. Congress is going to consider that entire legislative package plus the funding. Everyone is familiar with the basics of the funding levels that we have negotiated. The buzzword of 140 million. It's important to stress has yet to make its way through the United States Congress for appropriation. And we in concert with our counterparts in the U.S. executive branch are doing everything we can to lobby for its passage. And we will be available and are planned to provide some U.S. congressional testimony to that effect. Now, there are most everyone in here is aware that the legislative branch of the United States, federal government, is a bit chaotic at the moment, and those could have an impact on the status and the movement of our package. We are confident that it'll move, and we're confident that there would probably be not much adjustments to the funding level, if any. What we are not too clear on right now is timeline for its final approval. And both us and our U.S. counterparts who we negotiated this deal with are pushing hard to make sure that it meets that September 30th deadline at the end of this FY. but that's an important thing to note, okay? It has impact on what we do here in the FSM in terms of planning on, all right, how do we build it, and then to move from there upwards if necessary. Rather than planning for what hasn't been approved and then trying to adjust the other way. That's been our recommendation all along. Now, I need to acknowledge that we do appreciate and are grateful to the United States and its citizens for this continuing assistance that we have come to a bilateral agreement on. And we, just like in any negotiations, the FSM came into the negotiations with a certain package proposal. The United States came to the table with their package proposal. And over the course of the last couple of years, through some highs and lows in negotiations, we have met. And that agreement is what has been signed. I have to commend our counterparts on the United States side, their negotiating team, and certainly ours, under the leadership of Chairman DTCI and Director Elon, who send their regards and are regretful that they couldn't be here. But this negotiating effort has been truly a team effort. I'm very fortunate to be backstopped by some experience and some very seasoned leadership and knowledge in our work as we began our negotiations. And I'm deeply appreciative to them. And the reason why we were able to come to a bilateral agreement is because the United States side and our side, I think, for the vast majority of the time, were negotiating in what I would call good faith. And so, although there were times when things were a little rough, we tried to ensure that we kept moving forward in a productive manner. And so that's kind of where we are at the moment. We are preparing for both testimony with the United States Congress and testimony with the FSM Congress when called upon, because our Congress also has to ratify the agreement, in addition to the United States side. So I believe that within the audience today, we do have a couple of members of the JCRP team, one of them being the Honorable Speaker of Congress, the other one being Mr. Gerson Jackson. Where are you, Gerson? Sitting in the back here as members of our team as well. We're also very fortunate to have had, for a period of time, the Honorable Vice President of the FSM as a member of JCRP, whose valuable contributions to that effort were very notable. So thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I'm also going old school here. The agreement that we have reached, just so that it's very clear to everyone, we think is a comprehensive and a very solid and good agreement. It recognizes, continues to recognize each of our nation's sovereignties, and it continues to promote and support mutual interests of both of the nations. Now, it's no secret to anybody that things are a little geopolitically dynamic right now in this theater of the Pacific, and some of those things that are within the compact are reflective of that scenario out here in the Pacific at the moment. Things are pretty exciting. Please bear in mind that the entire package is a bump up in funding. And as we move forward and talk about this funding publicly, it should be noted that the funding is not just in sector grants, but it is also in a fair in the first 2 years of the compact. Now, that is an extremely beneficial part of the package because it immediately boosts the potential earnings of that compact trust fund to a level that is but good. There have been changes to the trust fund. That's not the focus of this particular briefing, but I'll be more than happy to answer some questions if I can on any aspect of the compact agreement as we move through today and as we are still here in Kosrae. I want to especially thank our very gracious hosts, the state of Kosrae, and the Sleeping Lady for tolerating us for this amount of time, and truly for the invitation of DTCI for JCRP's participation in this conference. So, slide number 1 here, I will attempt not to read it line by line, but it should be pretty self-explanatory. The sector grant amounts, the trust fund, an updated fiscal procedures agreement, a new compact trust fund agreement, federal programs and services agreement, as I mentioned before, is still ongoing, but very close to completion. And then you notice the last item here is the U.S. programs that we have agreed with our United States counterparts that will either continue or be reinstated. And as you look through these items, everybody's familiar with Pell Grants, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the judicial training. Those have been in place, and those are going to continue. They are contained in the implementing legislation that I talked about. That's where these programs live. They don't live within the four corners of the compact. They live in the implementing legislation, and the implementing legislation is restoring them. The other thing you see here is federal work study, federal direct student loans, FSEOG. Those, for those of you who've been around for quite a while, will recall that those last three used to be, the FSM used to be eligible for them. Through the fault of no one in particular, they dropped out a number of years ago. And recognizing that, the implementing legislation is language that restores FSM citizens to various social programs that way is ability to utilize the services of FEMA in the aftermath of a typhoon or a storm. Right now, FSM citizens are eligible to get immediate type assistance, shelter, food, but it's limited to that at the moment, so that in the event that our citizens, for example, lose their home and are wanting to take advantage of some funding from FEMA to help in that relief, that eligibility is not there right now. But it's going to be contained in the implementing legislation that goes up for congressional approval because the United States has agreed to reinsert it. So some things are signed, some things are under serious consideration at the moment, and we are poised, and we're poised to push it in the right light, and we are also poised and confident that it will go through as it is structure in the FDA. It's been modified a bit. Well, there's a lot of parts that have been modified, but this was one of the parts that we had tried very hard at the very beginning to get changed. it prioritizes and it puts the infrastructure support into a tiered priority within the FPA. With excuse me, with health and education being at the top most part of the list. What we have attempted to do and have been successful in doing is removing that tier system so that you give the FSM the opportunity to prioritize where it needs to prioritize, and not that everything automatically always goes to health and education first. Please bear in mind that this does not mean that we have placed less importance on health and education. Health, education, infrastructure are key foundations of any developing economy and any developing nation. But what we felt was we need the flexibility year to year to be able to prioritize infrastructure-specific projects as the nation needs, and not just get it shoehorned every time into just two sectors. So that was the purpose behind that. You can go ahead, next slide. We've already discussed that one of the things that the FPA is going to allow the FSM to do is to choose how much funding goes to which sector. And I think everybody's familiar with most of the sectors. They range from health, education, infra, capacity building, private sector development, etc., environment. So what the new FPA is going to allow us to do is choose what funding levels we want to allocate for which sectors. The exception to that is infrastructure. There is a minimum contained within the FPA and within our agreements that the infrastructure funding is going to be on this formula, no less than 25% of the 3-year moving average. That is a minimum, right? That's not a maximum. We would have rather that it had been a little more flexible, but we understand why our United States partners put so much emphasis on it, because we want to emphasize the 8%. But it was 30% of an $85 to $90 million package. We think that this gives us an acceptable amount of minimum infrastructure funding, plus we can allocate more to this sector depending on the year that we're in and depending on the needs of the nation. The second bullet there just talks a little bit about the current estimate for what we're staring at for carryover at the end of this FY. It amounts to somewhere in the low 100s, I believe. 90 of that being attributable to infra. And again, that's an estimate. And I've got to take a moment here to ensure that everybody understands, most people in this room understand, that carryover figure was quite a bit larger just a year and a half ago. That carryover infra figure was in the 200 plus millions of funding, which was not desirable, obviously. You can probably imagine how it presented a challenge with a needs and requirements based funding level. And it was far more than what we're receiving today. But it got a little difficult at times to try and push to that higher level of funding when we were carrying somewhere between 220 and 250. That's very frustrating, but diligent and dedicated work of our infrastructure professionals that has been driven down quite a bit. And with any luck, it may be driven down a little bit more by the end of this FY. But these are estimates at the moment. Any infrastructure carryover, like we briefly discussed yesterday, will continue to carry over infra here, get deposited into the compact trust fund. Infra carryover could be deposited into the compact trust fund only based on an agreement between the two governments. But the non-infra funds carryover is going to automatically be swept. Okay? And those will be available for use through a process and a procedure if the FSM decides they'd like to draw down on some of that that's been moved into the compact trust fund. I think you can go to, I'm sorry. We touched a little bit yesterday even on resiliency and the special needs, where we're headed for in this particular brief. Just suffice it to say that the resiliency mechanism has a cap of about 4% on it, and it can be used to defray the costs of inflation, because that 140 million is not adjusted for inflation. It's a flat 140. And so, big thing for infrastructure. Although we were able, implementation, management, and administration, the one place where it will look almost the same is on this project by project basis for infra. Now, it's been touched on in the last couple of days about the planning that's going to be required. What we that mechanism anymore, that wasn't able to be negotiated away. What we were able to negotiate is a slimming down of the authorities and basically the authorities of the JEPCO to do certain things. We've slimmed back their capability and authorities to specifically manage to a great detail, but what we will now be required to do, and what we think we should be doing, is to dedicate some very diligent efforts to planning, timely planning ahead of time. The concept is, if we've got our plans in place in the requisite amounts of time, that is states that if these plans show up at JEPCO with this, and this, which by the way are still current requirements, we just think that what we should do is front load it, get the planning done early, front load the documents so that by the time it gets to JEPCO, there's not this chaotic, sometimes disagreeable. What we would like to make sure we can do from an internal FSM perspective, it's going to take some time to get into that kind of rhythm. That's fine, working towards it. Is this the next slide? Sorry. Language on timing. I know that I've learned more about infrastructure during this process than I care. But I had to, and it was important. And so the little bit of extra knowledge that I've gained based on feedback from everybody was this timing issue with grant awards and ability to draw down, and why is this taking so long? We have come to agreement in principle, and this language is in the FPA on this third bullet. That's got a 30-day and a 60-day, 30-day and 60-day windows on it. And we did quite a bit of back and forth to try and get their processes and procedures as well. But this was the compromise that we reached, and we will diligently track this because it's something that's going to be important to us. Now, I will put this challenge out there on the table. If this is the kind of turnaround that we realize, we're going to have a part to play, right? We've asked for them to consider making this turnaround time the way it's written right now. So hopefully this this assists us in being timely with our processes as well. So we think that that was a fairly good way to do it, and so that's what's written into the FPA at the moment. This has been touched on at the SNLC, it's been touched on briefly here, the infrastructure development plan, the strategic development plan, and their importance in this new version of our compact. I will say this a few times as we go through. This is not new. The SDP has always been an important document, an important roadmap for the nation. It's just that as years go by, sometimes there's a tendency to not connect our efforts back to what the SDP and the IDP say. Bear in mind that it's not the compact that drives why we should have an SDP and IDP. We should have it as a nation. Compact will be one part of all of this. It just so happens that as we look to utilize compact funding, we're going to have to demonstrate its connection to these documents. And I do appreciate and continue to encourage the completion of these by, for compact purposes, the date's 31 March 2025. But as we all know, we could use an SDP and an IDP as soon as we can get it out. And the key here is that it needs to already have also made it through our legislative branch, not just completed, but also gone through and been endorsed and approved by our legislative branch of government. I think everyone in here knows what the contents of an IDP should be. You're a bunch of infrastructure professionals and you know more than I do about these things that are written here. But these are just meant to identify some key points. And again, the AIP, Annual Implementation Plan, that is going to be the plan for the nation for expenditures of sector compact funding year to year. And remember that those things in the annual implementation plan are also, as many of you know, not new. They apply to just about every sector, not just infrastructure. But they will be given great importance, and we should give it great importance because it defines what we're getting ready to do for the following year. If I'm not mistaken, these things in the AIP are not brand new issues either. Leasehold, title for land, preliminary budget projections, scope of work, that's always been part of what the requirement has been. It's important to just bring us back and reemphasize why they need to be paid close attention to. What I've talked about with regards to planning. Next slide. We had quite a spirited discussion yesterday on this particular issue, the infrastructure maintenance fund. We all know that it's been a challenge in the past to come up with matching funds for this. And we all know that the amount has been relatively low at 5% of the infrastructure sector funding. Both the FSM and the United States place a great amount of importance on maintenance. This was one of those periods of time during the negotiations where we really needed to slog our way through each side's thoughts on what IMF should be. There were initial ideas, both from the United States side and from our side, but when we finally concluded, this is what we settled on. There was at one time a proposal for a very large IMF, but a very large IMF every single year. And although it looked very attractive, we're also very conscious of capacity on the FSM side, and then and both in moving projects. And so we were attracted to the large amount remains, but it'll be gradually increased over the entire sector, not a percentage of infra. It's out of the entire amount for sector funding. I'm sure there will be more discussions on this as time moves along. But I do note yesterday that one of the things that our infrastructure folks had tried to emphasize, and rightfully so, is this consolidated maintenance plan. Out of everything that we could be doing now, that consolidated plan is something that needs quite a bit of attention, sooner than other things. And so it is my hope that we turn to, with the help of all of our states, we turn to on this effort so that we can start on a daily basis or on a yearly basis. I know that the list of maintenance requirements is long. I know that the funding required is extremely high. And I know that the funding out of the compact alone is not enough. But this is what the compact can provide. Nothing that says as we enter into amounts all the way up. Next slide. Number one here, spending, annual performance report, annual financial report. They exist today. They have to be as close to accurate as it can possibly be. Our performance at completing some of these reports in the past has not been the best. It's been hot and cold. And we want to just make sure to emphasize that it's gained a lot of attention, and we also should be very motivated to make sure that these are done accurately and timely, because they help the FSM to assess what it's doing with any kind of funding, whether it's from the compact or it's from anywhere else. Yeah, you can go to that next slide. Was that the last one? Okay. The stuff that we've pointed out here, like I said, there's some of these issues within the SNLC that was just completed in Point. And these are just highlights of the major changes. It's not an exhaustive brief. It's not meant to be. The FPA has got more details contained within it, so I would encourage everybody to give that a read when you can. We did what we thought was necessary to try and fashion an FPA based on 20 years of experience with the current FPA. I think that at the end of the day, there was a recognition, as we tried to convince our U.S. friends, that what we have to say about the FPA is relevant. We've lived with it, we've lived in it for the last 20 years, and we know where it needs to be adjusted. And so some of those adjustments we were able to get done. Some of the requirements from the United States were able to get done. There were compromises. So I do want to thank the infrastructure sector to try and drive that down as much as possible. It will hold us in good stead. Robert has been a key part of our negotiating team, and I know that he's backstopped by his folks who were undoubtedly on the phone with Robert while Robert was with us trying to work through the negotiations. So necessarily specifically address infrastructure. But if you recall, many of you will recall that as we started this JCRP negotiating process years ago, we had asked for some help from our executive line agencies at the national and the state levels to try and package what would be our core state levels got together desires for the next 20 years to include estimated costs for different programs. And this was done by all the sites at the beginning. I bring that up, number one, to thank, that was a very exhaustive exercise, as many of you will. And we are greatly appreciative of the state's efforts and the national government's efforts to contribute to that package that was put together. Because those initiatives that were contained in the package that was put together for the compact were not all able to be funded. But each sector had a prioritized kind of program and initiative for how to work the health sector for the next 20 years, how the education sector was going to work for the next 20 years. It was fairly well laid out. I would just recommend that we don't forget about that, because that could very well make work moving forward a little less cumbersome, because you've got a foundation to work from already. Just because all those programs were not able to be funded in full from the compact, they still represent priority initiatives and programs for the FSM, and they can still be in the IDP for infrastructure specifics. Those are still very valuable documents. And I would encourage, I apologize, we couldn't get everything. And just because the funding couldn't be available. But there was a lot of work put into that. We appreciate it very much. And we would encourage that that plan and that package that everyone worked so hard to put together doesn't sit on a shelf somewhere. It's a useful document. And as I close out, I will just make one more plug. It's exhaustive because we all know in my previous life, I think that's where most of my gray hair came from, was planning. My previous life with another profession. And we used to have a saying, the plan that you came up with doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. And you gotta adjust. It used to always crop up in our heads. I mean, why are we planning this far in advance? And why are we planning in this level of detail? Because you gotta have a foundation from which to start. You have to have a foundation from which to flex. And so it becomes valuable in the implementation of this agreement, of these agreements. It's going to become very central to how we are able to move. So, plan first, plan second, take a break, and then plan some more. I can't emphasize that enough. I am happy to take any questions, whether it's about anything that you saw here or anything that we, members of JCRP and others might be able to answer with regards to the compact writ large. But I thank you for your attention this morning.
Okay. So your question, just one announcement that cars parked behind.
There's a brown SUV parking behind somebody's car out there. They want to take off, but that one is blocking. It's a brown SUV with the plate number 1515.
Well, while we're on the subject of public service announcements, I did notice a car right outside this door with the lights on. Somebody may be looking for a ride a little later if that light stays on all day.
And everyone. Maybe this is just a clarification on the IMF. I see US is injecting for the first year some 7% from the sector grants. Does that mean it's coming from the 140 million?
It does. It's coming out of the whole sector. We had played with several different scenarios on the FSM side about pulling it out of infrastructure, pulling it, a different percentage. This is where we bilaterally landed. Okay? And there are those who will think of it as, well, wait a minute, that's just, that's out of the whole sector, and that means I have less funding over here. That's a true statement for a very important thing. Without a matching requirement. I mean, this is designed to work for us. And I hope that we can all ensure that we don't just, as has been mentioned before, we don't just look at it as just a daunting task and it's only 9 million and it's only gonna go up to 14 million over the course of 20 years. This is absolutely not enough. Let's take chunks out of it. And if 9.8 drops in our lap in September, I hope that we're able to use it. It's one thing to say, here it is. Now it's another, because everyone is familiar with the processes that everyone has to go through at the state level, at the national level. These things don't happen overnight. So I would challenge everybody to not just get the funding, but use it the way we would like to use it, the best way to use it. I'm sorry. Anyway.
That's it, Chief. Thanks for the presentation. It was about an hour long, very helpful. My respects to the Vice President, Speaker, Governor, all the heads of delegations, and everybody else here. My respects. This is not, my question is not, it doesn't deal with the infrastructure part, but I remember speaking about the security clearance issue that FSM citizens have with the compact with the US. I was wondering if there was any mention of that during the compact negotiations, and for our military personnel and civilian personnel that are working in the US that have security clearance for their jobs. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I appreciate you bringing it up to me a while back. The question centers around military members who are currently serving, and the instances where there are certain limits to how far an FSM citizen can go within the ranks without a security clearance, a United States security clearance. Security clearances are not things that are easy to come by in this day and age. It's tough for it's tough for a U.S. citizen. It's even tougher for a non-citizen. But that was the subject of a conversation that we had with the United States side, and it was left as an issue that doesn't have a place at the moment within the confines of the compact, but that it does within the government to government bilateral discussions that could take place on that. It was brought up, it was addressed, and our counterparts have gone to the DOD to start finding out how that can be mitigated. I can't give you a timeline on it, but I can tell you that, I know that I've discussed it with my counterpart negotiator and his, senior staff on that and some veterans issues as well.
Hello, Najaranda. I've got a couple of questions. One is, given our unique challenge in Chuk with respect to sites, land, can we use infra grants to secure land?
At this point, I don't think it's usable right now. Unless I don't know something. Currently, compact funds cannot be utilized for that. There is no provision, in the agreed to compact that allows the use of compact funds to purchase land. There is none that I am aware of, and it wasn't something that, was addressed in terms of funding for purchase of land. No, I would say it's not. Now, I'll try to look at it again, but as far as I know, that is not, that will remain something that is not allowable with compact funds.
My second question is whether we can use other sector grants for infrastructure purposes.
You're talking about, say, for example, health, or
Education, environment.
there is an ability right today, and health. There is an ability today to use sector funding for health, as an example, for a certain amount of infrastructure in the health sector. And I think education as well. Those remain unchanged. That there are allowable, not extensive, but there are allowable use for infrastructure within each sector. But they're not very, it's not very large. It's not for major projects. And please bear in mind that when we went into these, when we were organizing for the negotiations, we asked the sectors to identify the parts of their requirements. If they're infra, then it becomes part of the infrastructure request to the negotiations. So the packages that were put together, infrastructure met with all the sectors to ensure that the sector plans, infrastructure requirements were embedded within the infrastructure package and request. But there's nothing, to my knowledge, there's nothing that prevents each of the sectors from
Any final questions? Which is, just as how the infrastructure sectors come September, won't go in the carryover, wouldn't go into the trust fund. Is that the same for IMF, the IMF backlogs? So just as how you have infrastructure backlogs, those don't go in the trust fund.
are you talking about under the current scheme of 5% of the infra?
Yeah. Because I believe there's quite a bit of backlog for IMF in some of these states.
Yes, but bear in mind, it could, but it will be subject to the current rules, even if it's in the next fiscal year.
Right. 10% matching.
Yes. These funds on the IMF moving forward, once the package gets approved, that's what's not subject to matching. But if we have funding that is connected to current appropriations under US law, they will have to comply with the current rules. Unfortunately, it's not a wholesale shift, because those, I'll be more than happy to talk more about that offline if anybody wants to discuss it. But just don't be all liquored up when you want to discuss it with me tonight, okay?
Thank you, Shankar. Muna ibang graduate ng sa mga kapatid suka on Vice President, Speaker, all dignitaries here, and all of us present. The question I have is on that $90 million that's going over into the trust fund. When that gets moved into the trust fund, how do we access it? Is there any procedures now to access it? And do we access specifically the amounts that comes from each of the states, or it becomes a package that we can access all of that amount, or it's specific to the states carryover?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Thank you, Senator. First off, it won't be 90 million that goes into the compact trust fund. I think that 90 is an estimate for infra alone. What we are looking at that will automatically sweep is non-infra carryover to the tune of about 35 to 38 million. Okay, so just to make sure we set the numbers straight. Yes, the answer to the question is yes, it can be accessible. But remember that the compact trust fund agreement does not specify any particular state within the content of the agreement. The agreement is between the government of the United States and the government of the FSM. What you're referring to is something that needs to be internally worked out in terms of policy. As I think I tried to address this at the SNLC at one point, but if the environmental sector on a given year has $3 million in carryover and it gets swept automatically into the trust fund, does it still retain its identity as bone-based funding? I think that throughout the nation, we probably want that, but that has to be something that is agreed to before it's done. Because then when it comes time to draw down, as far as the compact trust fund agreement is concerned, it's a pot. The compact trust fund agreement is not going to say, well, that's Chuk share or that's Pompey share. That's going to be up to the national leadership to determine whether it retains that identity when it goes into the trust fund and how much you can draw. Because if Pompey's got 2 million that gets swept in, and Chuk has got 3 million that got swept in, and Yap just wasn't able to do much, and there's 5 sitting there, you total that up, it's fair game for anyone, as far as the compact trust fund agreement is concerned. But internally, that can be driven by national, by FSM legislation. So yes, it's accessible, but the decision on whether or not how much can be accessed by which state is something that needs to be worked out. That's an internal policy issue, and there are going to be some policy issues that need to be put in place. That's one of them. Is how is that going to work? We know that the funds are going to be there earning something, and if there's a desire or a need to draw down on it, okay, what has the nation decided on who can draw how much? That is not in the compact trust fund agreement. We have the flexibility to decide that.
And does that decision include the use of it? I mean, if we want to use it for infrastructure, or if we want to use it to supplement IMF, can we do that?
I will have to make sure that I can get the correct answer for that, because if it's been moved in out of a particular sector, and there's a desire to draw down on it, there may be a requirement to draw down to supplement that sector. I'll make note of that, but I need to check on the exact language. So that's one policy decision that's looming that the nation is going to have to figure out. The other one is potentially the use and the ability of the nation to draw down on the compact trust fund. There are currently some safeguards in place at more aptly described as caps. You can draw down so much out of using the resiliency or the special needs, but you can't exceed it, and that's due to the health and sustainability of the compact trust fund. The ability to access and utilize compact trust fund monies is a good thing because there's a little bit of a flexibility there. It becomes a not so good thing if we're not disciplined enough to ensure that we're not digging into what we are making a concerted effort to be able to utilize in the future. So it's going to be up to the nation's leadership to decide whether they want to place any limits on the use. I can tell you this: if we draw down on the compact trust fund every single year at the absolute caps every year for the next 20, it will impact the sustainability of the trust fund, without a doubt. And that's why the mechanisms were put in place, was to give us that flexibility. The danger is we abuse it. That's the balancing act, right? It's available, doesn't mean it has to be used. And remember, if it's carryover funding, as I mentioned yesterday, if it's carryover funding, for some reason over the course of the last year, it wasn't able to be used. And as it gets swept into the trust fund, another tranche of sector is going to land. So I would just consider those things as we move forward, especially with this ability of the trust fund. And it's the first time we're going to be able to do it, right? The intention of the trust fund was that in 2023 we transition our lifeline. It's still intended to be that. But on a bit of a philosophical note, the idea behind this increase in funding level is to get us moving so that as the years go by, we're using the funding level to strengthen and develop the economy. So that as we close with 2043, which is the end of the next period, we don't have to be solely reliant on the compact trust fund. Because we have built infrastructure, we have strengthened institutions, we have made things a little bit easier for foreign investment. Our economy is moving a little bit better than it has been, so that you don't have to completely rely on a very comfortable resource in addition to our domestic trust fund, which is an extremely good move on the part of the nation to create that, and it's doing fairly well. So, anyway, I will look at the details of that language just to give you a more solid answer.
Another question?
Mahalo. Wait, oh, sorry.
Thank you, and my respect to the leaders here and those in the context. But I have two questions. My first question is, I know that you've said that the tiering of infrastructure grant has been relaxed or will be relaxed in FY '24. Compact 3. Is that applied to the other sectors where health and education are the priority or just infrastructure? My second question is, I know we've submitted budgets, but the budget where we were advised to base it on FY '23 funding level. Now we have a substantial amount of money. Can we safely assume that, or say that we can readjust our budget, although it hasn't submitted? Thank you.
The question was, are we in a position right now, you recall I mentioned the guidance that we suggested on budgeting for the next fiscal year was to plan on current level. And the question was, at this point, can we go ahead and plan for that higher level? You can plan for it. I just wouldn't recommend it. Right? Have a plan in place to be able to be very things project